Last time we spoke about the Battle of Ormoc Bay. Amidst the fierce Battle of Leyte, November of 1944, American and Japanese forces clashed across rugged terrain and stormy weather. A typhoon swept the island, halting supply lines, while Colonel Verbeck's forces launched a determined assault on Breakneck Ridge, advancing against Colonel Miyachi's well-defended lines. Meanwhile, Japanese reinforcements suffered devastating losses from American air raids. Through relentless attacks and strategic maneuvers, the Americans gained ground, signaling the turning point towards a Japanese retreat and Allied victory over Leyte. Meanwhile, a Japanese convoy led by Rear Admiral Sato suffered devastating losses to Allied submarines and air attacks while attempting to transport troops. Concurrently, Australian and American forces launched aggressive operations in New Guinea, and American B-29 superfortresses, despite some challenges, intensified their bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. This episode is The Fall of Peleliu. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Nay, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. Over on my YouTube channel, I just released a full documentary based off my interview with Lieutenant Colonel Tom Williams and his experience during the Vietnam War. That raw interview can be found in a podcast form on all major podcast platforms. I also have a huge favor to ask. I recently opened up a YouTube membership. It's identical to my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either gets you access to the exclusive podcast with over 25 plus episodes and ongoing. You also get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. But if you decide to join the YouTube membership, you get a bit of a bonus. There's a lot of unlisted content I have been keeping around for years that have not been uploaded on YouTube for various reasons. A lot of it is kind of cringy and goofy, but you might like it, so please check it out. In our previous episode, General Gill's 32nd Division had just arrived to relieve the exhausted 24th Division to take charge of the main offensive down the Ormoc Valley. During this lull in the battle, General Kataoka took advantage of the pause to reposition his 1st Division, and he ordered Colonel Miyachi's 57th Regiment to counterattack towards Breakneck Ridge. The counterattack had limited success, ultimately leaving the 57th Regiment significantly weakened. On November the 16th, Colonel John Hettinger's 128th Regiment moved in to relieve the 21st Regiment on Breakneck Ridge, but was unable to capture Corkscrew Ridge following a fierce battle. Simultaneously, General Cunningham's 112th Cavalry was deployed to secure and patrol the Mount Minoro area, while Colonel Clifford's reinforced 1st Battalion advanced to Kalai Ridge behind Japanese lines, where it faced artillery fire and unsuccessfully attempted to link up with Colonel Chapman's 2nd Battalion roadblock on Highway 2. Over to the south, the 32nd Regiment moved towards Bay to launch a second push towards Ormoc, initiating an advance north to the Damelan-Caridad area on November the 14th. Meanwhile, General Yamagata's 26th Division, including Colonel Seito Jiro's 13th Independent Regiment, advanced in the same direction with the plans to assault Baranin, setting up a confrontation with the American forces on Shoestring Ridge. By November the 17th, Hettinger's 1st Battalion had entrenched themselves on the slopes of Corkscrew Ridge, while the 3rd Battalion progressed roughly 1,000 yards down the highway, securing a ridge about 500 yards north of Limon. At the same time, Clifford's patrols finally made contact with Chapman's 2nd Battalion, but they struggled to establish a communication line due to the strong enemy presence between them. The following day, Clifford positioned machine guns for a firefight against the enemy on the ridge to the southeast. Throughout the night and into November the 19th, Japanese machine gun fire targeted the perimeter, successfully disabling one gun and surrounding Clifford's southernmost outpost, eventually forcing the Americans to withdraw. Meanwhile, Hettinger's 1st Battalion launched another assault on Corkscrew Ridge on November the 18th, though it achieved only minor gains. Additionally, Colonel Kota Kijiro's 49th Regiment infiltrated the enemy's left flank, initiating a two-pronged advance towards Kalasian and Kapokan, but this had limited impact on Gill's offensive. As a result, Henninger's 1st Battalion continued its siege of Corkscrew Ridge until November the 20th, while the 3rd Battalion held positions on the ridge overlooking Limon. On November the 20th and 21st, Japanese forces also gained ground against Clifford's defenses on Kilai Ridge. At the same time, the 32nd Regiment had established a defensive stance on Shoestring Ridge, while the 13th Independent Regiment fortified the opposite ridge with trenches and machine gun pits and other installations, sending a reinforced battalion eastwards towards Marin. On November the 22nd, the 11th Airborne Division arrived to relieve the 7th Division, which subsequently redeployed to the west coast. Gill resumed his offensive, sending Henninger's 2nd and 3rd Battalions south, while the 1st Battalion contained Corkscrew Ridge. The Americans fought their way to Limon, establishing defensive positions along a tributary of the Ledi River south of the town after repelling a fierce Japanese counterattack. Meanwhile, Japanese assaults intensified on Kilai Ridge, pushing back Clifford's troops, though they held firm. Fortunately, the Japanese did not press further on November the 23rd, as Kataoka needed to reorganize his forces following the fall of Limon. To support the division's left flank along the Limon-Ormoc Highway, he dispatched the 49th Regiment and his reserve battalion, coinciding with the arrival of the 1st Regiment to reinforce the heavily weakened 57th Regiment. However, the withdrawal of the 49th created a significant gap between the 1st and 102nd Divisions, which the 126th Regiment quickly exploited, advancing through the hill 1525 area to strike at the enemy's rear. The 128th Regiment also took this time to realign and consolidate its positions, focusing the next 3 days on extensive patrols and placing harassing fire along the east-west ridge overlooking the highway about 1,000 yards south of Limon. Additionally, on November the 24th, the 112th Cavalry began advancing southwest from Mount Minoro towards the highway with a similar objective. With the occupation of Limon, the Battle of Breakneck Ridge concluded, costing the 24th and 32nd Divisions a total of 1,498 casualties, while the Japanese suffered an estimated 5,252 fatalities and had 8 captured. The American victory was largely aided by the establishment of a roadblock south of Limon by Chapman's 2nd Battalion and the defense of Kilai Ridge in the Japanese rear by Clifford's battalion. From November the 12th to the 23rd, the 2nd Battalion, 19th Regiment had defended the roadblock under extremely difficult conditions. The operations report of the 24th Division graphically summarized the deeds for which the battalion received a presidential citation. It is as follows. These bearded, mud-caked soldiers came out of the mountains exhausted and hungry. Their feet were heavy, cheeks hollow, bodies emaciated, and eyes glazed. They had seen 31 comrades mortally wounded, watched 55 others lie suffering in muddy foxholes without adequate medical attention. Yet their morale had not changed. It was high when they went in and high when they went out. They were proud that they had rendered invaluable aid to the main forces fighting in Ormoc's corridor by disrupting the Japanese supply lines and preventing strong reinforcements from passing up the Ormoc Road. They were proud that they had outfought the Emperor's toughest troops that had been battle-trained in Manchuria, and they were certain that they had killed at least 606 of the enemy and felt that the fire had accounted for many more. And they were proud that this had all been accomplished despite conditions of severe hardship. 241 of the battalion's officers and enlisted men were hospitalized for skin disorders, foot ulcers, battle fatigue, and sheer exhaustion. These units, facing constant fire and being heavily outnumbered, prevented General Suzuki from reinforcing Limon. Abandoning a potential counteroffensive here, Suzuki redirected his primary efforts to the Baronin front for his Wa offensive. Despite Yamagata's preparations for combat, the effectiveness of the 26th Division depended heavily on acquiring more heavy weapons, ammunition, and equipment. Thus, a convoy with 3 transports and a submarine chaser departed Manila on November the 23rd, carrying the essential supplies to Ormoc. As night fell over Shoestring Ridge, Sato finally launched his main offensive against the stretched defenses of the 32nd Regiment. Artillery, mortars, and machine guns provided cover for 2 companies advancing forward to capture sections of the ridge. The next morning, the 2nd Battalion of the 32nd Regiment reorganized its defensive positions, enabling the Americans to push back a Japanese force that had penetrated south of the Palanas River to the east of Hill 918. Meanwhile, General Tominaga initiated a large-scale air offensive to support Operation TA, the latest convoy, deploying 60 planes from the 2nd Air Division to strike the Ledi airfields, while 30 Navy aircraft targeted enemy shipping in Ledi Gulf. Over the next 4 days, daily air attacks were conducted in the Ledi area, and the 7th Air Division carried out coordinated strikes against enemy bases on Morotai. However, on November the 24th, the convoy's transports were sunk by an air attack off Masbat Island. Just another convoy consisting of 3 transports and 1 destroyer was dispatched to Ormoc. This convoy was similarly destroyed the next day off Merodunk Island by carrier aircraft, resulting in a complete operational failure. Back over in Leti, on the night of November the 24th, Sato's troops launched another ferocious assault against enemy positions, beginning with the heaviest artillery barrage the 32nd Regiment had yet encountered. The Americans quickly responded with their own supporting weapons, effectively repelling repeated Japanese attacks. Only Company K was pushed back, but American artillery, mortars, and machine guns prevented the Japanese from exploiting this breakthrough. After failing to penetrate the front lines, Sato's troops desperately attempted to neutralize the artillery, supporting the 32nd Regiment before ultimately retreating, allowing the defenders to regroup. By nightfall, the Japanese employed the same tactics as their previous assault, but were ultimately pushed back after fierce grenade battles and close-quarter fighting. At the same time, Karioka's newly deployed reserve battalion launched an attack on Kilai Ridge during the night. However, the weary defenders were able to fend off the assault, resulting in casualties for both sides. After reinforcing Shoestring Ridge, the 32nd Regiment faced another attack on the night of November the 26th. At 9 p.m., Colonel Sato renewed the assault against the American position, following the pattern set by the previous night actions. The Japanese first laid down motor and machine gun fire, and then heavy weapons fire of the 13th Infantry Regiment hit the right platoons of Company G, shifting to the east in about 15 minutes. Immediately afterwards, about a battalion of Japanese infantry attacked Company G, while 12 machine guns started to fire from a ridge 1,200 yards to the east. The Japanese moved into the fire of their own heavy weapons. The 32nd Infantry, using all of its artillery batteries, motors, machine guns, and rifles, started throwing lead against the enemy force as fast as the men could load and fire. The Japanese employed an estimated 50 machine guns, continuing to come on. All hell broke loose as the enemies shot off flares to guide their own artillery fire. The sharp declivity in the front of the American lines did not allow for close concentration of friendly artillery fire. Just as it appeared that the lines were about to be overrun, many more enemy flares went up and the Japanese withdrew, covered by heavy machine gun and motor fire. Colonel Finn, taking advantage of this fortunate circumstance, hastily rearranged riflemen to fill gaps caused by casualties and replenished his ammunition supplies. The motors of the regiment continued to fire into the draw. After a short lull, Colonel Sato renewed the attack. There was no preparatory artillery fire, but the motors and machine guns introduced the assault. The attack did not seem as determined as the previous one, though the number of troops was apparently about the same. The 32nd Infantry again called down all types of fire upon the enemy. Elements of the 13th Infantry Regiment continued to advance, although the carnage was terrific, and attempted to pass through the American lines. A strong enemy group moved into some bamboo grove and nosed in front of the center platoon of Company G. From this position, the enemy launched an attack, which the company resisted with grenades and bayonets. As Colonel Finn later reported, "The battle continued to flare up and died down as the valiant soldiers fought like devils to hold our lines." 81mm motors from the motor platoon of Company H fired 650 rounds in 5 minutes, and fire from 60mm motors was practically automatic. After an hour's intense fighting, the enemy force withdrew. Unbeknownst to the Americans, however, the left and center platoons of Company G fell back in confusion during the fight, allowing the Japanese to infiltrate the American lines in the bamboo thicket, previously occupied by the center platoon. The Japanese had not attacked the left flank of Company G. These troops heard the battle raging to the right and the sounds of the Japanese forming below them. A non-commissioned officer in charge of a listening post sent a man to get permission for his 3-man group to withdraw. After receiving permission, he shouted the order from a distance of 50 yards. As the men from the listening post started back, they were joined by the left platoon and 2 squads from the center platoon. Within 45 minutes, the 2 platoons less 1 squad, plus the section of heavy machine guns, were moving south on the highway. There was not a thought in our minds that the withdrawal was not authorized. After proceeding down the road for 250 yards, they met the executive officer of Company H, who ordered them back. It was too late. The damage was already done. Though the left platoon was able to regain its position without trouble, the 2 squads from the center platoon found the enemy well dug in the bamboo thicket, where the squads had been. It was later learned that there was about 200 hostile troops with 20 machine guns in that thicket. The Japanese were within the American lines and in a position from which they could fire a battery on the flanks of companies E, L, I, and K. Although the surprise defenders managed to contain the infiltrators, who seemingly did not recognize the Americans' precarious situation, as they made no attempt to capitalize on it, the situation remained unstable until the 1st Battalion, 184th Regiment arrived on November the 27th and regained the lost ground. At this point, all the assault elements of General Arnold's 7th Division had crossed the eastern shore of the Kemmot Sea, and the reinforcements were now en route. On November the 28th, the 184th Regiment relieved the exhausted defenders of Shoestring Ridge and successfully repelled a small Japanese attack that night. Meanwhile, Yamashita decided to shift most of his division towards Barun to initiate Suzuki's planned offensive, leaving only a small detachment to prevent the Americans from reaching Albura and cutting off the base of his attack. By the end of November, the 184th had successfully taken control of Shoestring Ridge and the Bloody Bamboo Thicket, although it was unable to advance further north due to the enemy's strong resistance. At the same time, Tominaga made an unsuccessful attempt to drop off a raiding unit over Barun on November the 26th, marking the first use of a tactic that would be repeated in the coming weeks. On November the 27th, Admiral Okawachi launched another convoy carrying heavy equipment for the 26th Division, which successfully reached Ormoc Bay overnight. However, it was intercepted by PT boats the following day, resulting in the loss of one frigate and one subchaser during the encounter. The convoy faced further attacks from aircraft on November the 29th, which would sink one transport before the remaining ships departed for Manila. On their return journey, the last two vessels were ultimately destroyed by airstrikes. Back in Leyte, on November the 29th, Clifford's exhausted troops managed to fend off one final heavy assault before being relieved by Hettinger's 2nd Battalion. By the end of the month, the Americans had solidified their positions on Kilai and Shoestring Ridges and were prepared to advance their two offensives against Ormoc. However, we must now shift our focus from the Philippines to Peleliu, where Colonel Nakagawa's remaining 700 men continued to hold out against American assaults with their dwindling strength. At the beginning of November, Colonel Watson's 323rd Regiment had taken over the task of neutralizing the Umabrogo Pocket, with Colonel Dark's 3rd Battalion on Walt Ridge and Mortimer Valley being the last unit remaining from the 321st Regiment. Now, after a brief pause in combat at the end of October, operations became more active again on November the 2nd. Watson's 2nd Battalion successfully attacked the Five Sisters from the southwest, while elements of the 1st Battalion advanced north along the ridges west of Death Valley, pursuing the remaining Japanese forces from the South Pocket. Meanwhile, part of the 3rd Battalion moved slowly south through the ridges and rugged terrain at the northern end of China Wall. However, before Watson could continue his offensive, heavy rains began November the 4th, escalating into a typhoon that persisted for 4 days. By November the 12th, no significant progress had been made by any unit, with slow patrols and sandbagging ongoing. The 81st Cavalry Reconnaissance Troop and elements of the 321st Regiment focused on securing additional offshore islets north of Peleliu. Attacks in the Umabrogo Pocket resumed on November the 13th, with Watson's 1st Battalion advancing eastwards from the ridges west of Death Valley, and his 2nd Battalion pushing north into the Gorge and Wildcat Bowl, though little ground was gained in the following days. Despite this slow advancement, a key center of resistance was identified in the rough terrain west of the central Death Valley. On November the 16th, oil was sent forward through a hose from fuel tanks set up in covered positions 300 yards distant, and poured into a large cave which seemed to be the center of a newfound defense. Ignited by white phosphorus hand grenades lobbed into the cave, the flaming oil produced such promising results in driving Japanese into the open or killing them that the same method of conquest continued to be used by the 1st Battalion and other parts in the pocket. Over the next 5 days, tanks and LVT flamethrowers targeted enemy caves at the bases of China Wall and the Five Brothers, effectively destroying or sealing all accessible enemy positions and leaving Nakagawa with only 150 men still capable of fighting. By November the 21st, infantry patrols could operate largely unimpeded throughout the Wildcat Bowl and the southern section of Death Valley. The next day, the 323rd launched an assault on the China Wall, where the majority of Nakagawa's weary troops were entrenched, effectively compressing the enemy into a space measuring 125 yards wide by 285 yards long. Meanwhile, November the 23rd, Five Brothers Ridge was finally cleared. The following day, a second assault on the China Wall gained additional ground, leaving only 57 enemy troops alive. To enable tanks and LVT flamethrowers access to the central hollow of the China Wall, engineers began constructing a ramp up the east wall on the northern end of the Wildcat Bowl. As the ramp ascended, Nakagawa realized his situation was hopeless. On November the 24th, Nakagawa burnt the regimental colors and he performed harakiri. He was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general for his valor displayed on Peleliu. His final message to General Inoue read, "Our sword is broken, and we have run out of spears." The 57 remaining soldiers were divided into 17 small teams, instructed to hide during the day and raid American positions at night. With the enemy largely absent, American forces cautiously advanced into the area. On November the 26th, tanks and LVT flamethrowers moved up the completed ramp to bombard the caves and other defenses in the hollow center of the China Wall. The next morning, as units from the north and south finally linked up, Watson declared that the hostilities had finally come to an end. What General Rupertus had anticipated would last only 4 days had in fact extended to nearly 2.5 months. The 323rd suffered significant losses during the battle, with approximately 118 soldiers killed and 420 wounded. The overall casualties for the Battle of Peleliu reached over 1,573 American deaths and 6,531 injuries. In contrast, the Japanese forces experienced a total of 10,695 men killed and 301 taken prisoner. Although the fighting was officially declared over and Peleliu secured, isolated groups and individual Japanese troops remained hidden in the pockets and caves, primarily in the northern part of the island and the Ermabrokel Mountains. For several months afterwards, the units of the 81st Division assigned to garrison the island continued to root out stragglers and seal off caves. Many of these soldiers would survive in the mountains and swamps until the war's conclusion and even beyond. In fact, a Japanese lieutenant with 26 men of the 2nd Infantry Soldiers and 8 men of the 45th Guard Force sailors held out in the caves of Peleliu until April the 22nd of 1947. They surrendered after a Japanese admiral had to come over and convince them the war was actually over. The effort to reduce the Japanese pocket around the Ermabrokel Mountain is often regarded as the most challenging battle faced by the United States military throughout the entire war. The 1st Marine Division suffered heavy losses and remained inactive until the invasion of Okinawa, which would begin on April the 1st of 1945. During their month in Peleliu, the 1st Marine Division incurred over 6,500 casualties, representing more than 1/3 of the division's strength. The 81st Infantry Division also experienced significant losses, with approximately 3,300 casualties during their time on the island. Post-war analysis indicated that the U.S. forces required more than 1,500 rounds of ammunition to kill each Japanese defender. They expended a staggering 13.32 million rounds of .30 caliber ammunition, 1.52 million rounds of .45 caliber, 693,657 rounds of .50 caliber bullets, 118,262 hand grenades, and 150,000 mortar rounds. The battle sparked considerable controversy in the United States, as many believe that the high number of American casualties was unjustified for an island with minimal strategic importance. The Japanese defenders were incapable of hindering potential U.S. operations in the Philippines, and the airfield captured on Peleliu did not significantly influence subsequent military actions. Instead, the Ulithi Atoll and the Caroline Islands was utilized as a staging ground for the Okinawa invasion. The casualty rate from this battle surpassed that of any other amphibious operation in the Pacific War. Moreover, coverage of the battle was quite limited, as only 6 reporters were motivated to report from the shore, influenced by General Rupertus's prediction of a quick victory within 3 days. The battle also received less attention due to General MacArthur's return to the Philippines and the Allies' advance towards Germany in Europe. And just an opinion from yours truly, it should have been bypassed. The battles for Angar and Peleliu illustrated the typical patterns of Japanese island defenses, yet few adjustments were made for the subsequent battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Naval bombardment before the amphibious assault at Iwo Jima proved to be only marginally more effective than that of Peleliu, while the preliminary shelling of Okinawa saw significant improvements. Underwater demolition teams, known as frogmen, conducted operations at Iwo Jima that confused the enemy by targeting both coasts. But this tactic later alerted Japanese defenders to the precise assault beaches during the Okinawa invasion. American ground forces gained valuable experience at Peleliu in assaulting heavily fortified positions similar to those they would encounter at Okinawa. Admiral William Halsey Jr. recommended canceling the planned occupation of Yap Island in the Caroline Islands. He also suggested that the landings at Peleliu and Angar be abandoned in favor of deploying their Marines and soldiers to Leyte Island. However, this recommendation was ultimately overruled by Admiral Nimitz. But now I want to turn our attention to the China theater. We need to discuss the conclusion of the pivotal Operation Ichigo, as the 11th and 23rd Armies pressed on with their offensive against Guilin and Luizhou. Back in August, following the battles of Hunan and Guangdong, the 11th and 23rd Armies of the IGA initiated offensives towards Guilin and Luizhou, respectively. The NRA troops defending the region were primarily remnants from the Battle of Hanyang, resulting in only 20,000 soldiers being present in Guilin on November the 1st when the Japanese commenced their assault upon the city. The Chinese government recognized that it could not hold Guilin, but chose to prolong the battle for political reasons, sending food and supplies to those besieged. Most civilians had fled Guilin weeks earlier, leaving the city heavily scorched by fire. Defenses were reinforced with pillboxes, barbed wire, and Guangxi troops commanded by the Muslim general Bei Chongxi. General Joseph Stilwell, who had a good relationship with Bei Chongxi, made considerable efforts to supply American munitions to him. Trenches were also dug throughout the hilly terrain. By early November, General Yokoyama's forces had effectively surrounded Guilin, with the 3rd and 13th Divisions ready to advance towards Luizhou, while General Tanaka's units were also preparing to move north following the fall of Wuxian. Consequently, most of Yokoyama's troops continued to tighten their grip on Guilin, where the determined defenders inflicted heavy casualties upon the Japanese as they facilitated the withdrawal of American personnel. Additionally, the 13th Division advanced through the Yongfu on November the 6th, the 3rd Division captured Lujiaozhen on November the 8th, and the 104th Division began its movement towards the area west of Luizhou. On November the 9th, just as the 11th Army initiated its main assault upon Guilin, General Okimura assigned the 3rd and 13th Divisions to the 23rd Army to enhance coordination for the attack upon Luizhou. Fortunately for them, the Chinese forces offered just minimal resistance, leading to the city and its airfield falling the next day. Simultaneously, with the support of the 5th Air Army, Yokoyama successfully captured Guilin, achieving the primary goal of Operation Togo Part 2. To eliminate the retreating enemy forces, the 23rd Army continued its advance westwards. On November the 15th, the 104th Division took Xincheng, while the 3rd Division captured Yuzhou, and the 13th Division moved towards Heqi, effectively cutting off the Chinese retreat and destroying the remaining enemy troops. The 3rd Division then advanced north, capturing Wanjian on November the 27th, while the 13th Division continued west, successfully taking Nandan on November the 28th and Dushan on December the 2nd. In response, Tanaka dispatched the 22nd Division and the 23rd Independent Mixed Brigade to capture Nanning, which fell on November the 28th. By early December, elements of the 22nd Division joined forces with the Indo-Chinese garrison near Changxi, marking the conclusion of Operation Ichigo. After 10 days of fierce fighting, the Japanese forces had captured Guilin and entered Luizhou on the same day. Sporadic fighting persisted as Chinese forces retreated rapidly. By November the 24th, the Japanese had taken control of 75 counties in Guangxi, encompassing about 2/3 of the region. Reports indicate that they had killed 215,000 civilians in reprisals and during crossfire, injuring over 431,000 other civilians. After the fall of Guilin and Luizhou, the majority of NRA troops lost their morale and retreated without ever confronting the enemy, leading to significant losses in both equipment and personnel. This event became one of the most devastating defeats of the entire Second Sino-Japanese War. Nevertheless, despite having destroyed the air bases in the area, the United States Air Force could still launch attacks on the Japanese mainland from their other bases. While the Japanese had achieved some objectives of Operation Ichigo, it ultimately expanded the territory they needed to defend and significantly weaken their lines, creating a favorable scenario for future counterattacks by Chinese forces. After destroying enemy air bases and annihilating the main enemy forces in the Guilin-Luizhou area, the 6th Area Army assigned the 22nd Division and the 22nd Independent Mixed Brigade to the 11th Army to secure strategic locations in the region, while the 23rd Army returned to Guangzhou and Luizhou Peninsula. By the operation's end, Japanese losses were estimated to be around 100,000 killed, 200,000 wounded, with an incredible material loss, including 1,938 small river vessels and 367 aircraft. In contrast, Chinese losses totaled approximately 310,000 killed, 410,000 wounded, and 80,000 captured, along with substantial war material losses, including 312 Allied aircraft, resulting in the deaths of 100 Americans. Additionally, the entire Japanese offensive resulted in the deaths of approximately 500,000 civilians. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, the Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. I have a huge favor to ask. I recently opened up a YouTube membership. It's identical to my Patreon account found over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. If you join either, you get access to the exclusive podcast, which is about 25 plus episodes and ongoing. You also get early access to all of the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. I also thought it would be a good opportunity to say this now. Since this is a Pacific War podcast, and it does seem a little bit redundant that I have a separate podcast called the Pacific War Channel Podcast, I've decided with my co-host to change the title to Echoes of War. It's going to be a general history podcast covering military events of the ancient history world, the Middle Ages, modern era, anything that the audience wants to hear more about. I have a vast amount of interests that lie in all types of different history, so we're going to be tackling just about anything you can imagine. For example, a very random one, I'm kind of a specialist in the Bosnian genocide, so I thought it'd be very interesting to cover that, which YouTube will not like, mind you. So please, if you think you can support the channel further, join my YouTube membership or join the Patreon account, as it's going to help me produce a lot more content. And what I mean by that is all of the proceeds from either are going to a new animator, so I can be alleviated from at least animating content on my YouTube channel and just focus on writing and narrating. And by all means, if there's subjects you want to hear about in the future, please go over to my YouTube channel, as there's a lot of polls going up. I'm looking for what you guys want to hear more about, so go let me know. The fight on Leyte gruels on, as the fight for Peleliu finally comes to an end. The controversial Battle of Peleliu would have major ramifications for American planners going forward. In China, absolute horror was continuing to be inflicted upon the Chinese people, leading to the massacre of hundreds of thousands of civilians in a war that just seems like it will never end.